Welcome everyone to this new conference. Today, we will explore a very interesting and essential topic: the importance of learning not to identify with the circumstances of our daily life, and the importance of stopping the habit of criticizing others. Overcoming these two common mistakes, identification and criticism, will help us ensure that the consciousness we are awakening through inner work does not fall asleep again. Let us begin by talking about non-identification, so that we may clearly understand what it means to identify ourselves with something. When we understand how frequently we fall into identification with the situations that happen to us, we will also recognize how this causes us to forget ourselves. Every time we identify with something, our consciousness loses its state of alertness. It becomes absorbed in the event, and the state of wakefulness, the inner presence through which consciousness can manifest, fades away. So what does it really mean to identify ourselves? To identify oneself is to become identical to one of our psychological defects. It is allowing a defect to take control of our human machine, of our body and our mind, so that we begin to think, feel, and act as that defect itself. In any situation that arises, if we do not maintain a state of self-remembering and inner awareness, and instead allow desire, justification, or the mechanical reactions of the ego to dominate us, then we fall into identification with that circumstance. We become lost in it. For example, if during an argument we identify with the defect of anger that emerges in that moment, we become anger itself. We strike, insult, shout, and think only of hurting, humiliating, or taking revenge. Our emotions are filled with hatred, resentment, and violence, all of which belong to the angry I with which we have become identical. When we identify with a defect, we give it control over all the centers of our human machine. The same occurs in a situation of lust. If a person does not maintain the memory of themselves, if the consciousness is not the one in command, then they become identical to lust. They will think, feel, speak, and act lustfully, making mistakes, wasting valuable sexual energy, and sinking deeper into degeneration, all because of identification in that moment. This is what happens to us day after day, moment by moment. We fail to maintain a state of conscious awareness because we constantly identify with fear, sadness, worry, joy, desire, jealousy, distraction, envy, criticism, sentimentality, pride, anger, tyranny, resentment, laziness, and so many others. If we truly wish to awaken our consciousness, we must make constant efforts to avoid falling into identification. When we become identified, we fall under a kind of hypnosis, fascinated by the scene that life is presenting to us, and we enter into a psychological dream. In that state, our consciousness, which is the capacity to perceive the objective reality of things, simply goes to sleep. It is therefore essential to identify and eliminate all the psychological defects, all the I's that manifest within us from moment to moment and in every situation we experience. A very useful exercise is to reflect each night on how our day went. This daily reflection helps us realize how often we became identified throughout the day and to recognize the psychological elements that prevented us from maintaining self-awareness. By identifying these elements, we can work on eliminating them so that the following day we enjoy greater inner clarity and expanded self-awareness, which in turn helps us avoid identification. Because this is how humanity currently lives, asleep during the day, lost in identification. And for that reason, at night, people cannot consciously enter the astral plane. They continue dreaming there as well. If we genuinely want to awaken consciousness, we must first realize how asleep we are and begin by awakening from this daily dream. We need to start seeing life as if it were a movie, a film filled with both pleasant and unpleasant scenes, yet all of them fleeting. Everything we experience in this physical world is temporary. Everything is devoured by time. People come and go, ideas come and go, things come and go. The entire world is illusory. No matter how intense a scene in life may be, it eventually passes and is left behind. The only thing that does not pass is the being, because the being is eternal. Therefore, the only thing that should truly matter to us is the being, our consciousness, because the being simply is. Everything else is transitory and illusory. It is true that, at times, we face difficult and complex situations in life. In such circumstances, it can seem impossible not to identify with what is happening. We see no way out, no solution to the problem life has placed before us. Yet, paradoxically, it is precisely within these adverse moments that we can gain the most benefit if we make a super effort to remain vigilant, self-aware, and present. Because consciousness, being wisdom in itself, can reveal a clear path, a new understanding, or a light that allows us to move through that stage of life while grasping the valuable lesson hidden within it. Unfortunately, what we usually do is the opposite. We magnify the problem. We feed it with our mental and emotional energy, worrying endlessly, turning it over and over in our mind until it becomes enormous, monstrous, to the point that we feel small, helpless, and incapable of facing it. When we see the problem as something too great to handle, our identification has already become too deep, and our consciousness has fallen completely asleep. From there, the mechanical imagination begins to project the worst possible scenarios, that we will lose everything, go to jail, suffer disgrace, or that our loved ones will be harmed. We must learn to observe how easily we fall into these fatalistic projections and understand that this negativity feeds heavy psychological defects within us. These defects reinforce the situation, causing it to persist and repeat. While we imagine all those catastrophic possibilities, we suffer as though they were already real, as if they were actually happening in that very moment. This is how identification makes people capable of committing terrible acts, even suicide, because a circumstance that began as something simple grows into a monstrous problem within their mind too great for them to face. If we reflect deeply on any problem, we'll notice that at its root lies fear. It is fear that keeps problems alive. We fear life and we fear death. We fear what others might say or think of us. We fear gossip, slander, poverty, hunger, humiliation, or prison. We fear everything, and because of that, our problems grow stronger and seem harder to solve. Therefore, if we truly want to dissolve a problem, we must face it directly and uncover the fears that sustain it. For example, in an economic problem, what do we really fear? We fear losing our job, we fear poverty, that our family will suffer, that we might go to jail, or that we'll end up in ruin. And all those fears drag us into inner darkness. In family problems, we may find eyes that fear what others will say, fear scandal, fear losing affection or comfort, or fear being alone. But when the eye that generates that fear is eliminated, the problem itself dissolves, it vanishes. Because in truth, it was only an illusion sustained by that defect. So the question we must learn to ask ourselves is, who is feeling this fear? When we observe in this way, we can discover the specific psychological defect acting through our mechanical imagination. If we stop identifying with events, problems, or situations, we can remain alert and watchful. It is in that state of alert perception that we discover our psychological defects. Once a defect is discovered, we must comprehend it deeply and then eliminate it. When we remove the defects that create fear and fill our minds with dark projections, problems lose their oppressive power. They become simple circumstances through which the consciousness can act. And consciousness, being pure wisdom, always knows how to respond correctly. We often think that by worrying, we will find a solution. But in truth, when we worry, we lose inner peace and even our sleep. As long as we are identified with the problem, we cannot access real solutions, because in that state, the light of consciousness cannot manifest to guide us. When we identify ourselves, we stop identifying the defect behind that identification. Instead, we project it onto others. When we are intolerant, we see others as intolerant. When we are proud, we perceive others as arrogant. When we try to impose our own will, we see others as tyrannical. Our defects always try to keep us identified, because as long as we remain identified, we cannot see or eliminate them. For those who walk the esoteric path, it is essential to begin a constant inner battle, not to identify with any psychological element, whatever it may be. If someone identifies with alcohol, they end up drinking. If they identify with gluttony, they end up overeating. Likewise, if we identify with anger, our consciousness falls asleep, and we can remain identified for days without remembering our inner work. That's why we must fight moment by moment to remain awake, to remember ourselves, and to keep observing ourselves. It is also essential that we learn to see problems as opportunities. In the pleasant moments of life, our inner work often weakens. Yet, in the most difficult situations, the heaviest and most deeply rooted defects of our psychology emerge, the ones that have trapped a great portion of our consciousness. If we learn to look wisely at these challenging circumstances, they become wonderful opportunities for self-discovery. Through them, we can recover large amounts of trapped consciousness and genuine wisdom by applying the process of psychological death. Now, let's study another aspect that prevents the awakening of consciousness. Why do we judge others? It is necessary to understand that we truly don't know ourselves, and that the people around us serve as mirrors through which we can see our own inner reflection. When we understand this, we begin to value human relationships much more deeply because they allow us to discover hidden aspects of ourselves, things that we usually don't want to acknowledge and therefore cannot change. If each time we see a defect in someone, we immediately observe ourselves, we can discover that there is a defect within us reacting to what we see. That inner defect doesn't want to be discovered, so it makes us criticize others, to project outward, and to fall asleep internally, thus preventing self-observation. What irritates or bothers us about someone else is always something we also carry within our own psychology, but that we dislike seeing reflected outside of us. That is why we criticize it. The law of the mirror teaches that everything we see in others corresponds to something deeply rooted within ourselves. For example, a lustful person tends to see lust everywhere. A thief tends to believe that everyone else is a thief. And sometimes we react because the opposite polarity of that same defect exists within us. If, for instance, I see someone spending money carelessly, and I have the greedy eye within, that greed reacts when it sees its opposite, wastefulness. And I feel displeasure. The laziness that annoys us in others is the same laziness that lives within us. But we can only verify this through self-observation, observing whether we judge from active laziness itself or from false diligence. The ego is always offended when it sees its own reflection. That is why, when we face something within others that we have not yet worked on in ourselves, something we have not understood, we tend to feel rejection, irritation, or judgment. If we truly possessed the opposite virtue to that defect, we wouldn't criticize, we would understand. Understanding generates compassion, not judgment. Take, for example, the alcoholic eye. Someone who drinks is in the active polarity of that defect. The abstainer, on the other hand, is in its passive polarity. But abstaining doesn't mean that one has comprehended or eliminated the defect. It simply means that the defect is repressed. This repression is revealed every time the person feels rejection or disgust toward those who drink. However, those who have already studied, understood, and eliminated that defect know its mechanisms. They know how it enslaves the person. Therefore, instead of judging or criticizing, they feel genuine understanding, and if possible, they offer help or guidance to anyone who sincerely wishes to overcome that condition. The key to all inner work is to always direct observation inward, to look at what we feel, what we think, what we desire, how we react, and to notice the internal dialogue constantly taking place within us. As we observe our inner world, we make many discoveries. And with understanding, we can gradually eliminate the psychological defects we have come to comprehend. But if identification takes over, the next inevitable step is criticism. We end up criticizing the very defect that we have projected onto someone else. Let's reflect on this for a moment. If we don't truly know ourselves, how can we possibly believe that we know others? We see someone on the street or on social media doing something, and immediately the inner judge appears. Ah, that one's a prostitute, that one is effeminate, that one is a thief, and so on. But who is really judging? If we look carefully at a pointing hand, we'll see that while one finger points outward, 3 fingers point inward toward ourselves. Those 3 fingers remind us that it is our own psychological defects that are judging outside what actually exists within. We must realize that what we judge in others is mere appearance. We do not know the hidden causes that led a person to act in a certain way. We only see an external circumstance, and from that limited view, we condemn. Let's now reflect on some of the consequences of criticism. When we criticize others, we lose the capacity to observe ourselves because our attention is entirely directed outward toward what someone else does or says. Thus, we miss the wonderful opportunity for self-discovery and inner transformation. Criticism puts the consciousness to sleep, and with it, we lose critical judgment. That is, the ability of consciousness to understand its own defects. As soon as we criticize another person, that sacred ability disappears. And since the person who criticizes does not understand, because they have not yet learned from that defect, life itself places them in the same situation they once judged so that they may experience it directly. Naturally, they end up acting in the same way as the one they criticized, or even worse. The judgments we make are always mistaken, for if we don't know ourselves, how could we possibly know the internal processes that lead someone else to act as they do? And what happens as a result of those wrong judgments? They become slander, which poisons our relationships with others. In esotericism, what truly matters is not the external bond, but the inner relationship we maintain with each being. When we judge someone, we become their inner enemy. Another important consequence of criticism is karma, because through criticism, we cause harm to others. We are not charged karma for what we merely think or feel, but the moment we express those thoughts through words or actions, we generate harm, whether directly or indirectly, and thus we create karma for ourselves. And what then are the benefits of overcoming these two great errors? What do we gain by ceasing to identify with the circumstances of daily life and by refraining from criticizing others? The first and most important benefit is that our consciousness will no longer fall asleep. We will begin to sustain a continuous state of awareness, a state that will gradually lead us toward complete awakening. We will start to remain conscious throughout the day, and this same clarity will reflect itself at night, allowing us to experience greater lucidity in the astral plane. Another great benefit is the recovery of critical judgment, the true self-observation of consciousness. Through self-criticism, we learn to recognize our own defects, mirrored in others. When we become aware of these defects within ourselves, we can consciously ask for their elimination. Thus, the work of psychological death proceeds powerfully and effectively. As we continue to dissolve our defects, we liberate increasing amounts of trapped consciousness, and in doing so, we advance steadily in our inner work. It is essential, then, to begin a conscious and determined struggle, a struggle to avoid identification with the events of daily life and to stop judging others. This inner effort leads us directly toward what is known as the awakening of consciousness. This concludes today's conference. If you have any questions or reflections about the topic, feel free to leave them in the comments. We'll be glad to respond. In our next conference, we will explore a very important theme, the third factor for the revolution of consciousness, sacrifice for humanity. There, we will understand the profound and vital importance of this factor in the inner work. You are warmly invited to join us as we develop this inspiring topic. Until next time.